Good morning. I am so excited to see all of your bright, shining faces after that really phenomenal talk by Mr. Frost. I'm curious, one more show of hands, how many designers in the room? Awesome. How many developers in the room? And how many people consider themselves both designers? Fantastic. And one more question. How many people do like internal design and development at an organization? And how many people do client work? Okay, awesome, fantastic. We'll cover all those bases today. So again, we're talking about designing for performance. So I'm going to cover image, HTML, CSS, tons of stuff about how to make all your designs as speedy as humanly possible. So my name is Lara. I work for Etsy. I am the Senior Engineering Manager of Performance at Etsy. And that means that my team helps everybody who's designing and developing and building more products for our end users to make their stuff as fast as humanly possible. For those of you who don't know, Etsy is a marketplace where people around the world can connect to buy and sell unique goods, and we had a very special day yesterday. So, performance is user experience. It's being factored into search engine results, and its effects on user behavior are being studied by major sites like Google and Amazon. What these studies found is that users expect your page to load in 2 seconds, no matter what device they're on, no matter where they are in the world. So make sure that if you're looking for a benchmark, you're aiming for this one. Because after 3 seconds, up to 40% of your users will leave your site. So take a moment and think about how you search for things on the web. How fast are you to close that tab and move on to something else if something isn't loading fast enough? We saw this evidenced in the experiment that we at Etsy ran. We added 160 kilobytes of hidden images to a page. Again, didn't affect the overall user experience except for page load time. And we increased bounce rate by 12% for people who are on mobile devices. DoubleClick found the inverse. They removed a URL redirect, and they saw a 12% increase in click-through rate for their ads. So again, envision you searching for things on the site, and then compare that to your users. Do your users have enough time to accomplish the one thing that they need to do on your site? And is your site fast enough to help make sure that they can accomplish that one thing? I think that Brad covered a bunch of reasons why our industry has not historically designed for performance. We're developing sites with increasingly rich content, right? Lots of dynamic elements, larger JavaScript files, beautiful animations, complex graphics, etc. We may optimize design and layout for mobile devices, but we don't always optimize for page speed on mobile. Some responsively designed sites have been irresponsible with the amount of page weight that we need to load the page. The great thing about page speed is that it builds trust in your website. You'll see more returning visitors. You'll see more people choosing you over a competitor. You'll see more people trusting your brand. This good user experience yields a ton of good things for you and your site, and optimized page speed is a huge part of it. And I want to make sure it's really clear. I'm not going to stand up here and say that you should make your site as fast as humanly possible. I'm here to say that you should make it as fast as humanly possible as a part of the overall user experience, balancing both speed and aesthetics. Sometimes you're going to make choices that sacrifice speed in favor of your brand or in favor of the design. And other times you're going to want to make sure that you're sacrificing a little piece of the design to make it a little bit faster. So take a moment and think about your most recent design. Do you have it in your head? I'm thinking about Etsy's homepage, all right? I'm going to ask myself some questions. I'd like you to ask yourself the same thing. What value do I think this large hero image is going to add? Maybe conversion rate, favoriting rate, returning visitors. Will 3 font weights really help drive conversions? Why not 7? Why not 2? What metric are we going to improve with this carousel? Aesthetics absolutely contribute to the overall conversion rate, favoriting rate, bounce rate, et cetera, just like performance does. That's why we should be thinking about this stuff for the design stage and then iterating and benchmarking as we go. All right, so when I talk about performance, what are we aiming for here? This is a good moment to bring up webpagetest, which is my #1 go-to tool for measuring page load time. You enter in the URL that you want to test, and then a site location and a browser or a mobile device. You can also choose your network speed. and it'll show you a bunch of really cool stuff about your site. The first thing it will show you is a waterfall chart, right? Not the horrible kind, falling down in a barrel, but the kind where you can see the number of requests needed to load your page. This is just a sample of what we need to load Etsy's homepage. Each of these rows is an asset, so it's CSS or JavaScript or an image. The more requests you have, the longer it's going to take to load pages. So we want to reduce the number of requests. The second thing we're going to optimize for here is the size of those requests. Again, just a sampling of what we need to load Etsy's homepage. HTML, some CSS files, some JPEGs, and they range here from like 8K to upwards of 74K. The smaller your files are, the more quickly your page is going to load. So we want to optimize for that as well. And then we want to think about perceived performance, which is actually way more important than your total page load time. We're going to talk a lot about how long your page takes to load, but really what we're talking about is how fast does your site feel? So over time, you're going to want to do things like make sure that the main parts of the page are interactive as quickly as possible, because it'll make your site feel speedy. So hold on to your butts. We're going to talk about images, fonts, markup, and then how to change the culture of your organization. We're going to start here with images. This is not a made-up graph. I didn't just like put a fake pie chart up here. This is really the average website and its total page weight and how much images are a part of that. And as you can see, images are a huge part of most page weights. This is obviously like the most low-hanging fruit that you can possibly get for page load time. So we'll focus on it first. We'll spend a bunch of time on it. Everybody knows JPEGs, right? They're best for photos. We all know this. But why are they best for photos? JPEGs are lossy. Their algorithm is loosely based on how humans perceive and discard information, pieces of information. So they're actually really good at smooth gradients in areas of low contrast, and they're going to be really bad at discarding information over high contrast areas or edges of a photo. So you've got some optimization options here. You can reduce noise and other complexity in your JPEG to make it overall smaller. You can decrease the export quality. So in Photoshop, like 50 to 75 is usually where people hang out, depending upon the quality of the image and how many like edges there may be that create artifacting. And then another interesting one is that you can blur unimportant areas of the image. This was evidenced in a recent article. Also, all of these slides are on larahogan.me/design, and so you can find this article on there, including the slides. This fellow took this picture of Ethan Marcotte, father of responsive web design, and he blurred out the background. So on the top, you can see everything is sharp. It's got a very long depth of field. And the bottom, he blurred it out to give it a short depth of field. Before the blur, the JPEG was 211 kilobytes, and after the blur, it was just 150, because JPEGs are good at discarding, again, information over smooth edges and areas of low contrast. So next up are GIFs. They're really only good for animations that can't be replaced with CSS. These guys contain up to 256 colors per frame. They are lossless, and please just don't use them unless you're up here. I promise you lots of sloth GIFs. This is an okay place to use GIFs, but on your websites, please avoid them as much as possible. If you absolutely must use a GIF, your main area of optimization here is dithering. So dithering creates an appearance of a smoother blend, and you can choose from 0 to 100. So on the left here, dithering is set to 0. On the right, it's set to 100. So you can see it's like either very chunky or very smooth. And the more the dithering is, right, the heavier the GIF is going to be. On the left, it's 4.8. On the right, it's 9.7. But check this out. I'm going to rotate this rainbow. On the left, I've got that same old rainbow, right? It's horizontal pattern, 9.7 kilobytes. On the right, when I make it vertical, same exact image, the GIF is 21 kilobytes. Super weird, right? It's because GIF's compression algorithm removes horizontal redundancy. So the more detail or noise vertically, the larger the file is going to be. So seriously, do not use them. You should replace animated GIFs with CSS as much as humanly possible, and then replace any non-animated GIFs with PNG8s. Why PNG8s? Same rainbow. GIF, 21 kilobytes. PNG8, 1.62 kilobytes. PNG8s are the same as GIFs, right? They're images with few colors. They're lossless like GIFs. They've got the same amount of colors in their color palette like GIFs. They dither like GIFs, but they recognize horizontal and vertical patterns. So they're so much better. PNG24s, which are actually like 32s because it's like 24 plus 8 with alpha transparency and this being PNG 32s. They've got no restriction on the color palette, but they handle transparency very differently. So if they can have all these colors, why not use them instead of JPEGs, right? Well, the thing is that PNG 24s are actually lossless. JPEGs are lossy. So when you have two pictures here, it's the same picture. On the left, 1.28 megabytes because it's the PNG. On the right is 288 kilobytes because it's the JPEG. JPEGs are going to be really good at discarding information, like how humans perceive lots of information. So after we covered image formats, let's talk a little bit about saving even more bytes in requests. The first best way to save requests is to think about SVGs. A lot of really good stuff has been written out there about SVGs and how to use them, so I won't go into like the nitty-gritty right now. The short version is you can replace simple images with SVG because they're an XML-based format. If you inline them, they will save you an image request, meaning going and fetching that image. The downside here is that means you won't have that image cached. So for a returning visitor, the browser will have to rethink through that SVG file. And it will make your HTML file a little bit more bloated depending upon how complex that SVG is. So like most performance things, you should be testing it and making sure it's faster for your site. Another thing to consider for saving request is spriting. We all know how to do this, right? You combine a bunch of images into one big image, you load it, and then you just have to like reuse that image with your CSS over and over again. On an old website that I worked on, we had these 10 thumbnail slots, and we rotated 26 images in and out of those little thumbnails. It was adorable. Look at that little baby's face. So we had each individual image originally rotating in and out. We then tried, we was like, I don't know if this is going to work. Let's try this. Let's combine it all into one sprite with 26 images in one request. We added about 60 kilobytes of overall page weight with the additional CSS and JavaScript in the larger image. But we ended up cutting page load time by 35% because of all the image requests that we didn't need anymore. When it comes to saving additional bytes, you should think through a tool like ImageOptim, Smushit, or anything else that will losslessly compress your images additionally after Photoshop. So in this case, I dumped some JPEGs in here. You can use PNGs or GIFs, and it will run it through tons of different compression algorithms and see which one works best for your image, and just squeeze those extra bytes. Everything that you upload to the web should be run through an additional compression tool like this one. So we did this at Etsy recently. We had a bunch of PNGs that were used in our template on the site. We ran all of them through this additional lossless compression. On average, we saved just under 20% of the file size per file, but in total, we saved 44% of the file directory overall bytes. So this was enormous for us, as you can imagine. But that was manual, right? You should actually be thinking about this automatically. You shouldn't have to worry about whether or not you remember to optimize something. Anytime you upload things to the web, whatever tools you end up using, try to build in a command line tool or some other kind of automated compression. There's a bunch of tools listed on larahogan.me/design, WordPress plugins, CLIs, et cetera, that you should check out for automating this kind of extra byte savings. All right, fonts. This is the part where I start fighting with the designers at Etsy. Probably a year ago, they ended up launching a new listing page that had like 8 new font weights loaded onto the listing page, and it was gorgeous. And you know what? It won in the experiment that we ran. We A/B tested it, and it was slower, but it was more beautiful, and it had an overall better user experience. So what I wanted to do is work with those designers to say, where can we save byte overhead? Where can we combine and condense things? Where can we repurpose things to make it a little bit better for our users in terms of performance? The important thing to note here is that older browsers download all the font face files that you include in your CSS style sheet, even if they're not used on the page. That combined with the fact that font files are actually very heavy means you should only import the font weights you absolutely need. Do not go overboard with your fonts. There's a couple of tools that you can use to optimize this stuff. You should be using a tool like Font Squirrel's Font Face Generator to edit the character subsetting in your font files. Let's take a look at what this looks like. You've got some language support here. You can choose your Unicode tables that you'll include, maybe character type. You can also add individual single characters to whatever you include in your font file. So here I'm adding like a heart and then like another little heart and like an E with an accent. So I'm able to actually pick and choose which stuff I absolutely need on the site, which means that my users are only downloading the bytes that they absolutely need to see the content on the page. If you go this route, which I do recommend you do, please document it so that your fellow designers and developers know how to edit it and know what's included in the future. This will save you a ton of headaches. Speaking of documentation, I want to talk a little bit about HTML. So the beautiful part about going through and cleaning things up to be a little bit more semantic and a little bit more repurposable is that it saves you development time overall and page load time. You're saving some headaches as well as end user experience stuff. I once went through a template and I cleaned it up. I didn't redesign it. I just cleaned it up a whole bunch to create some documented design patterns and rename things to be a little bit more semantic. This allowed me to clean up a lot of cruft that had built up over time in the template. Down here is file size for my HTML files, my CSS files, and my style sheet image files. And I got significantly smaller in terms of the file sizes of each of these things, which of course netted some really great page load gains. So as you're designing and developing, ask yourself, can someone else reuse this pattern? And any assets that get reused can get cached and will be awesome for your user experience later. Think again about what Mr. Frost just described as MIDI bootstraps for your clients. This is hotly debated, right? A site like Etsy, unfortunately, cannot go through and use semantic element names because we've got so many designers and developers working on it. But for any small or medium-sized site, this is my main recommendation for HTML. Rename non-semantic elements to be more semantic. This will help you, again, create more design patterns that can be repurposed, and it'll reduce a ton of cruft in your style sheets later. You should also go through and remove inefficient selectors. This used to be just inherently bad for performance. Nowadays, it's just your canary in the coal mine. If you have a class wide with an ID of sidebar with a link called search, it's probably an indicator that you're trying to override styles that have been set somewhere else, and it's an opportunity for cleanup. Probably eliminating a bunch of HTML elements and probably cleaning up your style sheets to be a little bit better organized. Just call it search. Just call it sidebar search, etc. And of course, that means that we're talking about divitis, right? You want to be removing as many unnecessary elements in your page as possible because it'll help you load the page faster. This is a screenshot using Firefox's 3D viewer. Firefox has this awesome thing that very few people know about, and I use this to prove that I'm doing work all of the time. So on the left, you can see the nested depth, right? So you can see on the left, there was a very large nested depth of my HTML elements, and after a cleanup and a little redesign, I had a much thinner nested depth. So use this to prove to yourself and others that you were doing some pretty cool work cleaning stuff up. So that brings us to responsive. I've heard it said that responsive web design is just inherently bad for performance. And I would like to prove to you that that is patently false. So why do we care about responsive? We all know mobile's taking over, right? This was a study done from like 5 years ago that showed the percentage of people in various countries that were only using their handsets to access the internet. They weren't using tablets or desktops. And while in the United States, we were only like 25% of people here were using their handsets exclusively to access the internet, globally, they were seeing a much larger percentage. And the problem is that mobile performance is terrible. So unlike on Wi-Fi, we can just connect to like some airport extreme somewhere, a cellular device has to establish a radio channel before it can get or send data. And this takes several seconds. The best part is if there's no data transmitted or received, after several seconds, that channel is going to go idle, which requires a new channel to be established. This can obviously wreak havoc on your page load times. On desktop, it usually takes like 50 milliseconds to go and fetch a piece of content and bring it back and show it to the user. On mobile, this can take upwards of 300 milliseconds, especially on 3G, which plenty of our users are still on. This is like as slow as old dial-up connections. But again, I want to prove to you, this does not have to be bad for performance. Everybody who says it can just deal with it. We've got a bunch of tools at our disposal. The first is a mobile-first workflow. If you start with your development or design workflow by thinking about the project from a mobile perspective first, you may be able to save like a ton of headaches down the road that often bloated desktop sites tend to face. And it can save you time by forcing big questions early, like what the core purpose of your page is and trimming out all the rest. There's a bunch of stuff that's been written on performance budgets. We use them at Etsy, and I find them hugely beneficial, both at the start of the project and throughout the entirety of a project. We'll document things like, how long should the page take to load over time? 2 seconds. How long should it take to load on mobile? 2 seconds. But what should that look like in the United States? What should that look like globally? What's our total page weight goal, et cetera? So we're able to document this stuff. It also allows us to have a little cap and trade as the project goes on. So if I want to add 40 kilobytes of font weights, I can say, all right, I'll save 40 kilobytes elsewhere. Maybe I'll compress some images further or something else. So by giving yourself a budget, it gives you a ton of flexibility for balancing aesthetics and speed. You should also be very deliberate about any assets that you load. You'll be making tons of choices about how things are displayed to the user, and that should include total bytes as well. We can see a screenshot here of Google's homepage with my Chrome DevTools open. So the size at which the Google logo is displayed is smaller than the actual file size that was served to me. So this means that I, as the user who took the screenshot, downloaded unnecessary bytes because the image was smaller than it was served to me. My guess here is that Google's sending me a Retina-sized version of the image. And since Retina displays cram twice as many pixels into the screen, we'll obviously want to send an image that can be compressed and shortened and it'll look really sharp, right? But this technique, although it makes images look really sharp, means that users are downloading a ton of unnecessary bytes. Enter picture. So your best bet for displaying a correctly sized picture in modern browsers is to take advantage of the new picture specification. So it'll tell the browser which file to download at which screen size or whatever, media query or whatever you might be using. And that browsers that don't support this have a ton of awesome fallback options, and so you can actually start using this stuff today. So here's a simple example. I won't go into too much detail because a lot of really smart people have written about this. So this example uses a media query to determine which image file to download. So the first source to match top to bottom is the one that the browser will go and fetch. It'll ignore the rest. And any browsers that don't support this will just get the image, the backup image. One additional superpower of the picture element is the type attribute. So if a browser recognizes, in this case, SVG, it'll go and fetch that really small SVG file. And any browsers that don't will get the fallback PNG. It's pretty smart. An additional consideration you can make in your responsive design is to use media queries to only load fonts on larger screens. We do this at Etsy. We don't want to load any extra font weights or font bytes for our users on smaller screens, so we use a media query to take care of this for us. Speaking of extra assets, look at this jerk. So the Google Plus button, when it was switching from the old button to the new button, loaded both buttons at the same time in like the awful switchover. This was before the days when things were loading asynchronously, so it actually slowed down our site. And from left to right here, this was Twitter, Facebook, like Google Plus, and the old Facebook share buttons. There is no reason why these things need to load synchronously. They should always be loaded asynchronously on your page. And if a third party doesn't provide an asynchronous script for you to use, you should demand it. You should also consider replacing things like this in your responsive web design with, say, buttons that you have a lot of control over and have very reduced overhead for your users. You should be making performance a part of your workflow as much as possible. The more you can build it in to your way of thinking and your way of doing things, the easier it gets. Automate all the things. Automate your image compression. Automate your image resizing. Utilize style guides. Again, those little mini bootstraps, right? Automate your performance testing as much as possible. Make it so you don't even have to think about performance. A ton of this has been open sourced. We at Etsy open sourced a way to automate web page tests, for example. So go and look it up, install it, and never think about it again. I want to cover some questions that I've heard right at the outset of a project, because you're probably weighing right now designs versus how fast the page is going to load. So I've been asked, can I please put a large hero at every single page at the top? The pro here, my aesthetic side, says, yeah, this is going to represent the brand really well. The performance side of me says, well, this could be a really large file, and we want to optimize for page weight. So my compromise here is like, yeah, sure. You know what? We're going to make sure that we optimize the hero as much as possible. Maybe we'll use a PNG8, right, or something with very few colors. And we'll ensure that it's compressed correctly and doesn't change much over time, so it's cached for our users. Should I use 3 display weights and a text weight in my design? Pro here, lots of flexibility in your typography. The con here, tons more requests, tons of bytes that your users are going to have to download. So my compromise, when we did this at Etsy, we said, all right, 2 display weights, and then for your body copy, you get to use a system weight, meaning you don't have to download unnecessary bytes. How will I demonstrate how our product works on this page? Aesthetically, I could say, oh, we could use a video or an animated GIF so you can clearly configure your product. Con here, though, right, the performance side says videos and GIFs can be really heavy and like really slow down pages for your users. So my compromise, maybe we'll self-host a video. We don't have to rely on YouTube, right, to load our video for us. We'll self-host it so we have total control over the performance, and we'll asynchronously load it on the page. My recommendation here is to test everything. Test everything. We test not just design changes at Etsy, but also performance changes as well to prove that they have an impact on the overall user experience and our engagement metrics. This is a little example from something that I ran recently. So I was able to see, did the add to cart rate improve? Did favoriting rate improve? Did my bounce rate go down? By proving this stuff out, you can say to yourself, yes, I am making the right choices for my overall user experience. A/B testing, as you might know, is very frustrating. I am always wrong. I can never guess what my users are going to really react to when they see this stuff, which is why for me personally, it's very important to prove it out. So at this point, you may be asking yourself, oh my God, this is like so many things I just heard, but like, how can I go home and make sure that I can get this stuff up and running at my organization? Who's really responsible for this stuff? I firmly believe that there should be no cops or janitors at an organization. It is not sustainable. You're going to get burned out. But this is probably the most difficult part of creating a speedy site, right? Getting your culture to care about performance. We at Etsy continue to struggle with it, and we've had top-down management buy-in and a data-driven development cycle for years. The primary thing here is that you want to help people feel the performance of your site. Empathy here is the most important. Use webpagetest videos to compare stuff. Show people a video of how your site loads. Compare before or after a performance improvement that you made. Show them how that feels. Compare your desktop experience to your mobile experience. Compare your domestic experience to your international experience. Compare you and your competitor. Really touch on that pride and see how people react when they actually start to feel your user experience. I also recommend being really public about it. We at Etsy, back in November 2011, Seth Walker, the original performance and engineering manager, published our first ever public site performance report. These numbers were embarrassing, but it had a really important impact on the way that we do things. By publishing these things and starting to publish them routinely, it forced us to iterate on and improve on our most important pages. And it reminded us that we're not the only people who are looking at these things. We got a number of calls from vendors who shall not be named that said, yeah, those numbers that you published, that's what we were seeing for you too. People are looking at your site. Your competitors are looking at your site. So it's not like publishing these things is any big secret. It also motivated our internal development teams to get better. We had this really horrific outlier, the home page of all things, that was the slowest page on our site by far. That's August of 2011. And then we had the follow-up report, this is the second low line. They not only went and improved it after that performance report was published, but they made it one of the fastest parts of the site. It was huge and amazing, and it really motivated our teams to start thinking about this stuff. And we really find it's important to celebrate this stuff. Right, the performance team, our job is not to make the site faster, it's to help everybody else make the site faster. So whenever we have someone, in this case Dan Miller, who's an engineer at Etsy, who recently sped up the site and a bunch of our APIs, we will celebrate this. We have a little cross stitch that says heart, heart, heart performance on it. We force them to hold it, and then we take a big picture because we're real excited about it, and we showcase them with graphs. We do this every single quarter. You can see a bunch of our previous performance heroes up here. People love this. We put this on a huge dashboard monitor. People come up and ask me, hey, can I be the next performance hero? And I'm like, yeah, make the site faster, and you will absolutely be the next performance hero. And I'm not kidding. I put this up on a wall with a bunch of other stuff. Here's our videos. You can see here, mobile on cable connection went really fast versus a mobile shaped 3G connection, really slow. People are forced to look at this stuff. People are forced to see how slow we are in Australia. You can't ignore it, right? These are our real users, but we every day are sitting on these really shiny computers, right? Or our shiny devices on really beautiful, fast network speeds. We forget what things are really like all over the world. So it's my job to make sure that everybody who's around me is empathetic for our users. And this is actually not just with our users. My job is to empathize with the rest of the company as well. I need to help my fellow designers, my fellow developers, upper management to care about how we do things, but also how our users are feeling things. As Mr. Frost says, good performance is good design. There's a ton of other improvements you can make to the back end, but 80 to 90% of performance and end user experience happens on the front end. On a mobile, it's upwards of 97%. So optimize for good performance, and you will have a huge leg up on creating an optimized and excellent user experience. There's a ton more stuff. It goes in a lot more depth in my book, Designing for Performance. All proceeds from this book go to helping women and girls learn how to code, so I highly recommend you pick up 12 copies for you and your company. And that's it for me. Thank you so much.